All right, world history. We're going to continue on our Chinese dynasty tour. Now we're going to talk about the Zhao dynasty. The Zhao replaced the Shang, and as we talked about yesterday or the day before, depending on when you're watching this, but as we talked about the last time, in the video, it talked about how there was a ruler of the Shang dynasty. At the end of the Shang dynasty, the king went a little bit crazy. He wasn't a very good ruler, and he was taking stuff from his people, so they started to fight a civil war. And then he locked himself in his palace and burned it to the ground, committed suicide with all his stuff. So that was the end of the Shang dynasty. So after the civil war, the group that took over was the Shang dynasty, or excuse me, the Zhao dynasty, and they had the same government system as the Shangs. They had the cities with the warlords, and the warlords were the same as the Shang dynasty. They had rich farmers. They were members of the aristocracy, and they would be appointed by the king. One of the big differences between the Shang and the Zhao dynasties was the king was chosen by a mandate from heaven. And we'll talk about the dynastic cycle and the mandate of heaven here in a little bit. Um, this lasted over 800 years until civil war broke out again. And that's kind of the way most civilizations work, especially when it's broken into 7 different pieces. But the states and the warlords fought against each other. One of them started to consolidate power. The Shin dynasty, the territory that was fought in the Civil War, ended up being the winner, and that started the new dynasty. Two things that are different from the Shang to the Zhao is the invention and general widespreading of iron weapons. So Shang was during the Bronze Age, and then during the Zhao dynasty, iron became a thing. And the difference between iron and bronze is that iron's a lot harder metal, so it's better for tools, it's better for weapons, it's a lot more durable. So when you make something to last longer, you have to use less of it, so that was all positives. The other thing, the other big change that came about during this time was the cavalry became a thing. Horses has been around for a while in China, but they were mainly used as farm implements, pulling the plow, hauling this, hauling that, what horses were used for back in the day. But some of the warlords were able to crack the code, and they started fighting on back of horses, and they found out that they were much tougher to stop. If you're walking and somebody rides up on a horse and has a spear, it's a lot tougher to stab them than if you're just walking next to them. So they found out that was a good thing, and they started to use the cavalry more and more. It became more efficient soldiers, and then all the leaders started to ride on horses. We're going to watch a really quick video on the Zhao dynasty, and it's not really on the dynasty itself, but it's one of the tombs that archaeologists uncovered. And you're not going to be able to understand any of the talking going on, but I just kind of wanted you to see what the tombs look like, because when we talked about the Shang dynasty and the Zhao dynasty and all the dynasties of China, much like the dynasties in Egypt, the rulers are ensconced in a tomb with all their stuff. So Chinese dynasties and kings did the same thing as the pharaohs in Egypt did. I just kind of wanted to have you take a look at one.
因为刘家墓地在史书上没有记载在这一块有存在，所以第一个呢，我们觉得它
And I just wanted to have you take a look at those tombs, so you have an idea of kind of what they look like. As one of the things you can probably notice right away is that unlike the Egyptian tombs with the pyramids and stuff like that, where they were up above the ground, these were basically in the ground or right on ground level and dug down. And they had their own little compartments inside of the tomb where the individual graves were. And if you were a king or something like that, those were, of course, much larger. Next thing we'll talk about is the dynastic cycle of how they picked rulers and the mandate of heaven. Okay, so mandate of heaven. Here's how this works. There was a belief that the kings were chosen by the gods. And that was a fairly common practice along all major early civilizations. Greece, they were picked by the gods and the oracles. Rome, same thing. Caesar was appointed by God. Egypt, they were gods on earth. They were living embodiment of God. And in China, also, the rulers were picked by God. The difference is that if they were a good ruler, you got to keep your power. So as long as everything was going well in China, and as long as everything was going well in the city province that you were in, you were good. If you weren't doing the things that you were supposed to be doing, if the people decided that you weren't a good ruler, you could lose their power. You were expected as a leader to rule the proper way, and the way that was called, it was called a Dao. Dao means that you did things the right way. You protected people from God's wrath, things like floods, famine, droughts, things that as a ruler you had absolutely no control over, but that was what you were expected to do. If you were chosen by God, then people assumed that you had a link to God, and you could, if there was flooding, you could ask God to send out the sun and dry up all the rain, and if there was no rain, you could ask God for rain, and He'd make it rain because you were chosen by Him. So obviously, you had to have some sort of line of communication with Him. And it was also a reason that if somebody started coming to power in your city-state, then you could overthrow the current ruler and say, well, he hasn't done this and this and this. And it was basically a built-in excuse. Gods have now chosen me, and they have eliminated you. The difference between Egyptians and every other civilization, including the ancient Chinese, were that the Egyptians believed that the ruler was a god on earth, and everybody else just believed that their rulers were picked by God. So there's a little bit of difference there. So here's how this dynastic cycle works, just so you can see it. A new dynasty claims the mandate from heaven and restores the peace. So that's how it starts. There's this, just like every other, the Shang and the Zhao and the Ji and all these other different dynasties that kind of follow the same thing. Is they rule for a while. The 7 warlords, one of them starts becoming more powerful than the other ones. He has more land, he has more wealth, he has a bigger army, whatever that thing is. Starts invading other ones, takes them over, and as soon as that civil war happens and the winner is crowned, then that's your new king, and that's the mandate from heaven. So after you win your civil war and you become the new dynasty, you redistribute all the land to the other 7 warlords that you pick. And then because it's a war, you have to rebuild your walls and your roads and your canals and all those things that are destroyed during a warfare. You have to rebuild all those things. And just like every other ancient civilization, over time, there's corruption, there's bad rulers. Again, like every other civilization, it's a bloodline thing. And so, your son becomes the king, and his son becomes the king, and his son becomes the king, and on and on and on. Well, occasionally you're gonna have one that's not very good, and so or you're gonna have people that are close to the king that are taking advantage of this and that and the other thing, and your dynasty starts to become corrupt, and that kind of ends that. The other thing that happens is, like I said earlier, with the you don't have your line to God, so your Tao. There's disasters that occur. There's floods. There's famines. All these different things. There's invasions from other territories aside from your 7 city provinces, and all that stuff happens, and pretty soon the controlling party loses control, and that's a sign that the mandate from heaven is being removed from whomever is in charge. And so that's a way to justify your rebellion, because you can say, hey, look at this. I have all this power and I'm starting to do this. And the guy who's in charge right now, we got famines and floods and all this stuff. So then the dynasty overthrown the previous dynasty and is replaced by a new one, and the cycle starts all over. New dynasty, new warlords, rebuild, things go bad, somebody new rises to power, starts to overthrow the current government, is justified because this one or two bad things happen, they take over, and the cycle just keeps going and going and going throughout the entirety of the ancient Chinese history. There's going to be one more link after this video. It'll be a short video on the mandate of heaven and the dynastic cycle of China, and that will be the notes for Wednesday. If you got any questions about anything, please don't hesitate to give me an email. Talk to our sub, and he can text me if it's something that needs to be answered right away. I've already had a couple of those this morning because I put the wrong date on homework. The other thing is there will be a little bit more homework now that I'm not here, as a way to make sure that you guys are staying on top of what we need to learn. All right. See you in a couple weeks.